As the chair said, this is a scene-setting presentation for the discussions on the policy solutions. The question that we've been asked to look at is, how will the structure of the aviation sector be changed by COVID-19? And that's obviously an interesting question, because I think arguably COVID-19 is a demand shock. Our customers have been prevented from spending their incomes on air travel. If we move to the next slide, what we've seen in the history of the industry is very significant structural change, but it's been driven largely by events on the supply side. We've seen disruption from technology. We've seen disruption from the liberalization, the deregulation of markets, and also from new business models. And you can see here the LCC, the inexorable rise of the share of the low-cost carriers. We saw the start of the low-cost carrier model when we saw markets being deregulated, first in the US in the 1980s and then in Europe in the 1990s. One of the outcomes of US liberalization was the development, the innovation of the hub and spoke model, and arguably the Gulf super connector airlines were the big users of that. That business model has faced some difficulty in recent years. And then, of course, the Chinese economy has been integrated into the world, and we've seen the emergence of the Chinese airlines. If we move to the next slide, this has all really led, this sort of innovation, this structural change from the supply side has led to the efficiency and competition that was mentioned just now. If we look at the impact of these structural changes on the unit cost of air transport services, we've seen something like a 90% fall since the 1950s. Initially driven by technology. We saw the introduction of the jet aircraft, the Boeing 707. In the 2 decades following that, we saw a halving of air transport costs. And then, of course, we saw the deregulation that the benefits of which we'd like to protect as we move into more normal conditions, give an additional boost to the decline in the cost of air transport services relative to other goods and services in the economy. And this decline, this 8-fold decline in the cost of air transport is obviously one of the major reasons why this is such a fast growing sector. And obviously that's bringing some of the challenges of climate change impacts with it. COVID-19, as you can see with that last data point, 2020, has partly reversed that decline. We did see the cost of air transport increase last year, essentially because fixed costs had to be spread over a much smaller output level. But as you can see, there's still a huge downward trend. And if we move to the next slide, one of the other points was raised by one of the participants was, what is the value proposition of air transport to the world? I think this slide encapsulates it, because it's not just that air transport of goods and services and people is done at a lower and lower real cost, lubricating the flows. But also, the industry has connected more and more cities. So, the number of cities connected with regular air service has more than doubled in the last 25 years. And it's those virtual air bridges between cities that I would say is the sort of the key driver, not just of benefits to users, because that obviously gives choice and at lower and lower cost, but these also drive the wider economic benefits, because those bridges between cities provided by air transport services enable really important economic flows, trade. 35% of international trade is by air, and that supports global supply chains, as well as obviously the pharmaceutical distribution that we're seeing at the moment. And that, I think, is the critical value proposition that air transport provides. It is essential for the modern economy, as it is essential today for getting vaccines around the world. And you can see at the end that connectivity, just measured here by the number of city pair connections, did take a hit in 2020 as a result of COVID. There were 18% fewer cities connected in 2020 as a result of COVID. And the question, of course, we have today is that temporary, or is this a long-lasting change? We can see, if we move to the next slide, what is being planned in the schedules of airlines. And this shows the intra-European international markets. And it shows our measure of connectivity. And there are different ways of measuring connectivity. But I think we all agree that the value of connectivity, the value of an air service, depends on the destination, both for the user and also for the wider benefits to an economy. And so what we've done here is we've weighted destinations according to their size, their importance, to give a measure of the value of connectivity, the level of connectivity, in this case, within Europe. So as you can see that in the April schedules, we are seeing an expectation of a recovery of connectivity in the second half of this year as travel barriers are relaxed, as we see the vaccination roll out across Europe. But not full recovery. In fact, those by the third quarter, 25% down on pre-crisis levels of connectivity. And I guess the question again is this a temporary feature, or is this something permanent? One thing you should notice is that in February, schedules were actually more positive. There was an earlier and larger recovery of connectivity expected in February. And actually, if we look back at the last 12 months, that has been a feature of schedules. We've seen persistently services scheduled, but then having to be cancelled. And I think there are two main reasons for this. One is the clear risk that we've faced and the uncertainty we faced about the virus and the vaccine rollout. Airlines have scheduled these services because they thought markets would be opened, and we've been repeatedly disappointed. But then the second reason is that we've seen a change in consumer behavior. We're seeing much later booking of flights, much closer to the date of departure. Before the crisis, 50% or so of tickets were bought more than 4 weeks before the flights took off. Today, more than 40% are sold within a week of departure. So that gives airlines very little visibility of whether they're going to be able to be cash positive on their flights. And so that is forcing scheduling and then cancellation until we see travel barriers coming down. But moving to the next slide, it's not the same in all markets. This shows China. The red line shows the Chinese domestic market. And I guess the first point here is to note that in the second half of last year, the Chinese domestic market had fully recovered to pre-crisis levels. There's a clear willingness to fly on the part of consumers, at least on domestic markets. But what a contrast with China's international schedules in and out of China, which are sort of barely moving. And according to the schedules, we're only expected by the end of this year to recover to 50% of pre-crisis levels. So I think we've got a clear issue with connectivity, particularly on international markets, whether or not we'll see that full recovery. But the Chinese domestic market, just before we leave, we saw full recovery. It's a big market. In fact, it's the biggest air transport market at the moment. And we can see actually what it's produced if in the next slide is that one of the structural changes that we've been seeing in the industry is an eastward shift of the center of gravity of air transport markets, of air travel markets, which, back in the early 2000s were over Western Europe, but are now, over North Africa and the Middle East, because of the growth of aviation is taking place in the East, in the emerging markets rather than the mature markets. And this is quite important for the location of hubs, and this is the reason why the Gulf superconnectors have had such an advantage in their geographical location, because they are in this, more or less the center of gravity of the industry. What we saw last year was that center of gravity jumped sort of 20 years ahead to where we were forecasting, where we are forecasting it to be in 2039, 2040. I think that's just temporary, but I think that's an interesting shift that we've seen. But let me move to the next slide, because I think that typically, if we're looking at structural change, in the past, it really has been driven by supply side changes and not demand shocks. And that's because the demand shocks that you can see in the top part of this chart have actually not lasted very long. We've typically seen shocks like SARS in 2003. That was back, travel was back to pre-crisis levels after 6 months. The 91 global recession after a year. 9/11 terrorist attacks after 16 months, and after the Great Recession, that took about 18 months for travel to recover. Those were demand shocks that, arguably didn't really lead to any structural change in the industry. So is COVID-19 any different? Is this just a temporary crisis facing the industry of the sort that we've seen before, but actually won't lead to any change in how aviation services are delivered, or their level, or their price? I mean, I guess one difference, of course, is the depth of this crisis. We've never seen anything quite like this, and the duration of it could well be longer. And there's a well-known economic effect of this sort in labour markets, hysteresis, where if people stay unemployed for too long, they lose skills. And so what starts out as a temporary effect becomes long-lived. The fact that people have not been flying so long, is that going to lead to permanent effects? Arguably, there's a hysteresis effect on business travel, which we'll come to. If we move to the next slide, I guess the first point is that this demand shock that we've faced has actually been rather different across different aviation markets. The worst hit has clearly been international air travel, or the international passenger market, which is still, as of February, March, down 89, 90% to pre-crisis levels. Domestic markets have seen a much more robust response. And in fact, March was much better than those figures that you can see there. We're now about 1/3 down on where we were pre-crisis. But air cargo has actually been barely affected. Air cargo services have continued, and arguably, in many ways, those, the performance of air cargo, the service provided for international trade, is one of the key wider economic benefits provided by air transport services, and that's continued, supporting those global supply chains. But if we move to the next slide, international trade hasn't come away unscathed from the impact of COVID-19, because although the level of service, those cargo ton kilometers are now back above pre-crisis levels, the cost for shippers is significantly higher today than it was pre-crisis, perhaps 50% higher. That's because there's been a severe capacity shortage for air cargo services. which has driven those shipping costs higher. And if we look at the next slide, you can see why. It's not because air freighters, it's not because the freighter fleet has not been available. In fact, freighters capacity is up 20%. It's because travel restrictions have grounded the passenger fleet. And in a normal year, more than 50% of cargo is carried in the holds of mainly wide-body passenger aircraft. So those travel restrictions are having a major side effect on international trade, or the costs of international trade, because there's been a shortage, as you can see from the black line, an overall shortage of cargo capacity. Now, is that a permanent effect? I think that as the passenger fleet comes back when travel restrictions fall, we'll see the cost to shippers back to normal levels. I think that's a transitory effect. Although, I think you'll see airlines treating cargo with much more attention in the future. So there could be some byproducts, some perhaps benefits for that wider economic benefit, the support for international trade. If we move to the next slide, one of the questions we were asked to consider in this session was, what government policies or regulations may have held back the recovery. So if we can move to the next slide, one of those policies is the slot regulations around congested airports, the administrative system that allocates that spare capacity. And the question is, have the waivers of the 80-20 use it or lose it rule, which has enabled incumbents to hold on to slots that they're not using because of the coronavirus crisis, has that stopped those slots being used by other airlines? I mean, clearly, as an economist in theory, yes. But I do wonder in practice whether that has been the case. I mean, this chart here shows what two of the major ultra low-cost carriers in Europe were doing in the summer last year. And actually, despite the slot rules having been waived, they were still opening up many new routes and adding many flights to these new services. So, the expansion and the increased connections provided by those airlines, it didn't seem to have been stopped by those slot rules. And if we move to the next slide, one of the other features, of course, is that many of those slot-constrained congested airports are actually very expensive to operate out of. So the tier 2, the secondary airports are often very much cheaper. And so, rather than it just being slots as a constraint to these airlines being present at those airports, it's likely also because of the cost. I think that it's clear that one of the main policy constraints to the recovery, if we move to the next slide, have clearly been the travel restrictions. This is one measure of them. And we saw that in January this year, those restrictions tightened even further as we saw those variants of the virus emerge and cause such a challenge to the control of the virus. And if we move to the next slide, we can see the new cases of the virus and how it really got out of control in the latter months of last year. And then we saw the emergence of the new variants in January, which caused a further spike, a further wave. We're yet again going through, another period where control has been very difficult. If we put India on this chart, that would be almost off the scale. So clearly, those travel restrictions, do have a justification. Clearly, governments need to control any transmission of the virus. But I think we'd also acknowledge that much of this is being done without being risk-based, without any sort of cost-benefit analysis. And in many cases, governments, and particularly health ministries, are aiming to eliminate risk rather than trade it off. But I guess, though, one of the issues that we must also acknowledge is that it's not just about risk. It's also about uncertainty, or what nowadays seems to be called radical uncertainty. You know, we just don't know, in some cases, the behavior of the virus. But I think if we move to the next slide, what we do know is that the vaccines that we have been very effective at both treating and preventing this disease. There remains some uncertainty with future variants, of course, but I think that the vaccination rollout is a game changer, and the vaccination rollout, you know, should allow those international travel restrictions to come down. And there have been great successes in countries at the bottom there, the UK and the US, which look to have vaccinated 75% of their population by the summer. But another feature of what we're seeing happening is a very uneven rollout of vaccination, particularly around the emerging countries, the developing countries. So I think this is inevitably going to prolong travel restrictions in some markets, and I think that's clearly, you know, a key restraint to getting back to normal. But the vaccination should, in principle, allow allow those travel barriers to come down across the world. But it might be a matter of several years rather than months. But given that we know that the travel restrictions themselves are the key policy barrier to recovery, what about demand? I think we've seen for pretty strong evidence, and if we move to the next slide, strong evidence that consumers still want to travel, and there's still very good evidence of pent-up demand to travel, at least for consumers that wish to travel for leisure and visiting friends and family purposes, perhaps not business. But you know, this is just one example when in November last year, the UK relaxed their travel restrictions on travel from the UAE. They no longer required a quarantine for travellers from the UAE. And you can see just within a matter of weeks, the bookings situation went from 80% down to 10% up on 2019 levels. You know, a huge surge of bookings there. And if we move to the next slide, if we look at the actual travel experience that we've seen, the passenger kilometers flown internationally on certain markets, we've seen the same pattern of pent-up demand when restrictions are lowered. You know, when Europe last summer installed a number of travel corridors where quarantine requirements were removed, we saw travel surge to, you know, almost 40%, just 40% below where it was pre-crisis, before those restrictions, of course, were reimposed when we saw the second wave in Europe. And in the Americas, we saw a number of countries remove quarantine requirements and put in place a requirement for a negative coronavirus test. And within Central America and South America, you know, we saw that produce strong demand as well. So I think on the demand side for leisure and VFR travel, I'm not sure that there have been any permanent effects. But there is a question mark, I think, over business travel. And the next slide just really, so I guess, you know, points to some of the areas where we are at risk, I think, of seeing a permanent change. And I think this is another of those hysteresis effects. And in this case, of course, it's because of getting used to, for such a long time, communicating like this on a Zoom platform or another video conferencing platform. In many ways, this is again an area of uncertainty. We just don't know in many cases. I mean, we do know that companies are not sending people out on business travel today, but in 2 years' time, I think there's clearly a risk that some activities will see a permanent loss, conferences, incentive type travel. But what we do know is that there's a real value in face-to-face meetings. There's good scientific evidence of the value of that for transferring tacit knowledge, for building, developing relationships. And so I think we should expect to see businesses to want to have face-to-face meetings in the future. So what does this all add up to? If we move to the next slide, clearly there's been huge short-term damage to travel in both last year and we think this year as well. We think this year the number of passengers will be only 52% of their pre-crisis 2019 level. That's essentially because of the restrictions on travel. As vaccination rolls out, our expectation is that pent-up demand for leisure and VFR travel will mean there's a pretty good recovery in travel over the next 2 or 3 years. So by 2023, back above 2019 levels. And looking longer term, clearly we think there will be some permanent structural damage on the demand side, principally to parts of business travel. That will add up, we think, to something like 2 years of lost growth. So, I mean, certainly not as significant to any of the supply side structural changes we've seen over the years. But what about the financial implications? If we move to the next slide, clearly there's been a big loss of revenues. If we move to the next slide, airlines have lost about $173 billion this year and next year, and others in the supply chain, airports and others, similarly affected. If we move to the next slide, now we haven't seen many failures despite this huge shock because governments have provided aid of almost $230 billion. Now, this has been uneven across the sector. More has been provided in North America and Europe than elsewhere. So clearly, this policy, this aid could distort competition in the recovery period. However, I think it depends what that aid was, how that aid was provided. The dark blue lines show that much of that aid was provided in the form of debt, have to be repaid. Where equity has been provided, in some cases there have been remedies required, slots given up. And obviously, if it's a wage subsidy, if we're looking at competition within a country, competition, for instance, between flag carriers or LCCs, that's been available for all employees. That shouldn't distort competition. If we move to the next slide, I think one of the reasons that there will be a permanent effect, or at least a long-lasting effect on airlines and others in the sector, is that survival has meant a huge increase in debt. So there's been something like a $220 billion rise in debt, huge rise in leverage. So firms' free cash flows for years will be required to pay down this debt and not be available for investment in expansion or improvement of service, unless we see a huge injection of new equity into the industry. So one of the other policy discussions that we're going to be looking at is the ownership and control restrictions. Arguably, the restrictions on ownership and control could limit companies, airlines' access to new equity from overseas. So it's possible that those restrictions, could constrain the return to health of the airline sector. But what we've also seen, of course, is massive government intervention in the sector. And my last slide just raises the issue of whether that government intervention will be enduring and cause permanent effects, because governments have put taxpayers' money into airlines. Governments have taken equity and ownership in many airlines. So we've got a sector where we have got more government involvement. Will this be a constraint on the Darwinian creative destruction that is normally an essential part of an adjustment to shock? Normally we would see airline exits and the more efficient remaining in the industry to provide a better and a more rapid recovery to full health to provide those services. That may be absent this time. Thank you.